When I was growing up, I was pretty sure that I wanted to be somebody important. I'm sure I'm not alone in that. We all wanted probably to be somebody important. But what does that mean exactly, to be important? Uh, in my mind, as a young man, I equated that with being someone famous. So when I was young, I wanted to play pro sports. That way everybody would know who I was and I could be famous and I could be important. Later, I figured that being important meant being someone wealthy. And so I, for a time, had aspirations to get a law degree and become one of those high-profile attorneys. You know, the kind of attorneys that you see on the news or that can command huge fees for their services, because I figured that wealth would make me important. And then I began to think that being important maybe was something a bit more than that. It meant having an impact or an influence. So I thought about then becoming a public servant, running for mayor or governor or even president of the United States, and that would be somehow the way to become important. And then later still, I realized that making an impact didn't have to necessarily be nationwide, didn't necessarily even have to be statewide. So I decided that I'd become a teacher, and that by being a teacher, I could be important. And all those things that I just mentioned, I guess, are ways of being important in their own right. But ultimate importance probably isn't found in our wealth, is it? And it's probably not found in our fame. And it's not even necessarily found in how many people we're able to serve. All of you are important. All of us are important, not just to someone, but most notably, we're important to the someone. We're important to God, and we're going to talk a little bit about that this morning. Another thing I did when I was growing up is I sort of crafted my own theology. I had this theology of good, I'll call it. But there again, what does good mean? Like important, we can kind of assign our own definition to it or our own standard for it. And in my theology of good, what ultimately mattered was whether you were a good person or not. And I reasoned, of course, that the concept of good was pretty universal, that we all knew it when we saw it. And that, of course, in my theology of good, I was one of the good ones. The standard of good was something you'd know if you saw it, and it would always conveniently rise or fall to fit my personal need. That was part of my theology of good. And this is what I held on to for a time as I was growing up and becoming a young man. I'd like us all to turn this morning to Psalm 25. We're going to talk about losing ourselves and finding God. Myself, as a young man, was at the center of all my thoughts. Myself was the one that I looked out for the most, the one who I was most interested in promoting. And in my theology of good, myself was even the standard of what it meant to be a good person. And therefore, what it meant in some ways to be right with the Almighty. And all of those theories were okay for me as long as they didn't get challenged. As long as there wasn't an occasion where they really had to be scrutinized. But once I found myself in a sticky spot, I was not so confident in my theology of good, nor in my standard of what it meant to be important. Psalm 25 is where we'll start this morning. And we're going to highlight here a couple of specific verses. For those handling the Zoom meeting online, we're about to click to the next slide. And in Psalm 25, verses 16 and 17, specifically, the scriptures read, "Turn to me and be gracious to me, for I am lonely and afflicted. Relieve the troubles of my heart and free me from my anguish." We'll get back to those in just a moment. The verses I just shared from Psalm 25 suddenly started to resonate with me. I didn't even know they existed yet, by the way, and they started to resonate with me. I could relate to this passage before I knew it ever existed. And I think a lot of us can do the same. We find ourselves in a moment of struggle or a moment of anguish, and suddenly we are called to question the things that we believe, the function of our life, the convictions that we hold dear, whether we are good or what is good, what is meaningful, what is important. Those things all start to come into sharper focus once our life and its continued existence becomes a little less certain, or we perceive it at least to be a little less certain. So my ideals, they worked for a while. Eventually, though, I learned I was wrong about what it meant to be important. I learned that I was wrong about what it meant to be good, or even the idea that good was universally understood like I thought it was. Because different people, it turns out, have a very different definition of what it means to be good.
Right.
I had considerable time to reconsider these convictions of mine in 1990 and 1991. I was just fresh out of high school. I joined the U.S. Army. I wanted to get a little bit of college money to get my undergraduate degree. So they were offering the Army College Fund and the GI Bill, and I took them up on that. And in exchange, I had to give them 2 years of active service. Just so happens that part of that 2 years of active service found me as part of the Operation Desert Storm, Desert Shield. At first, when we got there, a lot of free time. We were just trying to amass the number of troops and get the infrastructure behind us. And so we had a lot of time to think, a lot of time to look out into the desert sky, play touch football, play cards, and just wait. There was no danger yet. It seemed like a long field trip in the desert. But then things began to change. Around January of 1991, actual conflict started, and rounds were being fired, and bombs were being dropped, and Scud missiles were being returned in our direction. And lo and behold, someone from my unit perished in the conflict, someone that I knew. We weren't close friends, but he was someone that I knew. And it dawned on me at that moment, hey, we'll probably win, but we're not all going to make it out of here alive. And at that moment is when I began to question whether or not my theology of good was the one I was ready to go to the grave with. That guy did the same job that I do, essentially. He died doing it. I could die doing it. Am I ready to pass from this life? Do I even know what good truly is? Am I confident in my own definition? Has my life been important? I want it to be important. Has it mattered? These were all questions that were swirling around in my head. So when I witnessed the finite nature and the fragility of life, I questioned those things. And the answers did not come very easily. They didn't come very quickly. In the words of Katy Perry, I know you guys ever do Just Dance on your Xbox or your PlayStation, but one of my favorites is the Firework. It's an awesome tune, right? Make you go up, 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 right? Firework, right? But there's a line in that song that says, do you ever feel like a plastic bag drifting through the wind, wanting to start again? Right? It's kind of cheesy sounding, but it's true, right? You sometimes do feel a bit adrift, right? A little bit meaningless, a little bit like, do I matter? I'm just a plastic bag floating on the wind. I felt that way. I totally did. And this Psalm of David described pretty well how I was feeling personally. In verse 1 of Psalm 25, it says, it is the glory of God to conceal a matter. I'm sorry, verse 1 says, no, this is Proverbs 25. I'm in the wrong place altogether. I deeply apologize. Let's fix that. Okay, Psalm 25. I'm going to be in the right place. In verse 1. Here we go. I trust in you. Lord my God, I put my trust in you. Do not let me be put to shame, nor let my enemies triumph over me. No one who hopes in you will ever be put to shame, but shame will come to those who are treacherous without cause. So show me your ways. Teach me your paths. Guide me in your truth and teach me. For you are God, my Savior, and my hope is in you all day long. This idea that God had a path, or that God could instruct me or guide me in his ways or teach them to me, was something I had never really looked into. I mean, I was 19 years old. There's not a whole lot of 19-year-olds. There are some that exist, I'm aware, but it's not very common that a lot of 19-year-olds are at the end of themselves, looking to be taught, looking to be led by something beyond themselves. I found myself in that situation. I didn't even know this passage existed yet, but I was feeling these things. So here's what I did. Having reached the end of myself in a vulnerable moment, I let go of my own insights. I released my own notions about what it meant to be good, what it meant to be important, and I sought after God. I opened up my heart and my mind to the possibility that the answers I was carrying around weren't sufficient, but that God's were. So what do you do in that situation? When you reach this place where you're willing to search after God, how does one actually find God? Well, I think we try praying. For those controlling the Zoom meeting, I'm clicking to the next slide. This photograph pretty well captures, and I think Tony can probably relate, this photo pretty well captures what it looks like when you're in the desert at night. Josh can relate as well, right? You see the stars better than you're ever going to see them probably stateside here. I mean, it's incredible, right? So I'm in my Humvee one night, somewhere in the Iraq, Kuwait area, and I look up at the stars, and in my seeking after God, I just start with a simple prayer. Like Psalm 25, I just ask for guidance. I ask God to show me his path, teach me his ways. I didn't say anything nearly that eloquent, though. I just looked up at the stars and said, God, I just want to know what it is that you want me to do. And that was about the size of the prayer. It wasn't much longer than that. It wasn't more powerful than that. It was something simple. And I wasn't expecting one of the constellations to start talking back to me. I was not expecting some sort of thundering direction from above. I had no idea really, as far as a timetable, what to expect in terms of an answer to this question that I was speaking into the desert night sky. I wasn't even sure if I'd see or sense anything in return, but I was giving it a shot. Well, night turned into day, and I'm clicking again. And our job the next morning was to go out and protect one of the United States military assets by hiding in the middle of the desert about 6 or 7 kilometers away from this base, this communications base. So what we did is we took our camouflaged Humvee and we drove it into the middle of what you see here and just parked it. And our job was to shoot airplanes out of the sky or helicopters out of the sky. So if a plane or a helicopter came to do damage to this asset that we were protecting, lo and behold, they didn't know we were there waiting for them, and we would fire a missile and eliminate this threat. Well, as it turns out, no airplanes or helicopters were coming to do any damage, but we still had to be on our post. And this is the day after I had said this prayer into the night sky. Across the horizon, like the one you see here, a tiny little speck started to go from east to west. And as we looked at it, made its way halfway across the horizon, it started coming toward us instead, kicking up the sand and dust behind it. And about a football field or so away from our vehicle, driver got out of this car, holding in his hand a book. holds his hands up and just begins to walk toward us with the book. He approaches the Humvee I was sitting in, and he hands me a Bible. In the middle of a Muslim country, in the middle of a desert, not near a road, not near a town, he hands me a Bible. Not just any Bible, but a Bible written in very plain English. It's referred to as the Good News version of the Bible. It's written on a very simple reading level. I was moved.
Yeah.
I understood the timing was pretty quick on the prayer that I had spoken into the night sky. I found myself in the midst of a literal desert, and now I was being delivered a map, a plan, a path. The desert that I was in, it was vast. As far as I could see, there were no distinguishing marks, no towns around, no features. If this guy were just out passing out Bibles, he was using the least efficient method he could possibly have come up with to make this happen. That was clear to me. I didn't see this as accidental. I realize that there is an infinitesimal chance that this just was a random person driving around the desert in a Muslim country handing out Bibles inefficiently to people who just so happened to the night before ask God, what do you want me to do? I recognize that there is some level of possibility that that's just coincidence.
Oh my goodness.
But I think that if God exists, and I believe that we believe that, that's why we're at church today,
Right.
that this was God reaching out to me in answer to a prayer.
Amen.
When the Bible was delivered, I was struck by the timing and the simplicity of what I was reading. Not just because it was a good news version of the Bible, but because it was very understandable. I expected the Bible to be really difficult to grasp. There was all those pages and no pictures, right? But what I realized as I started to read through the book of Matthew was it's incredibly accessible and applicable and relatable. It stood out to me that God didn't respond to my question, what do you want me to do, with some grand answer like, I want you to become a missionary. Or I want you to become this thing for me. I want you to be my vessel and I want you to go to this place. It was nothing like that. Instead, it seemed that in quickly granting me a simple copy of the Bible, what God was saying to me was something akin to, I just want you to get to know me. I just want you to know who I am. We all think we know who God is. I'm not accusing you. I'm including myself right in the lump here. We all think we know who God is. And that picture is painted for us by a whole bunch of different things, from the way we're raised to the type of programs that we watch or books that we read or fictions that we allow ourselves to get engaged or involved in. Experiences we go through where we cry out to God and He either answers or doesn't answer, or we perceive an answer or don't perceive an answer. And so we start to think we know who God is. And I was certainly carrying my version with me. But the more I read the Bible, the more I realized the picture of God that I had wasn't accurate. The God that I pictured was hard, demanding, difficult, overpowering, wanted something from me, expected a lot of effort, wanted to limit my amusement and my fun, wanted me to be boring or super religious, whatever that means. That's what I thought.
Right.
And one of the reasons that I probably, whether I knew it or not, one of the reasons I concocted my own theology of good was because I didn't like that God that I had a picture of in my mind. And I wanted to sort of reinvent something that I found more palatable. And I find this to be a common experience amongst most of us human beings. Let's turn to Matthew chapter 7.
Take a second, Damon.
In Matthew chapter 7, if I could get a volunteer to read verses 7 through 14, that would be great. All right, James, you've got it.
Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives. He who seeks finds. And to him who knocks the door will be opened. Which of you, if his son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for fish, will give him a snake? If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. For this sums up the law and the prophets. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it.
Thank you. These verses from Jesus describe something very profound, and yet at the same time very simple. God isn't hiding. We don't really even have to go find him. He is evident. God is not lost somewhere. God isn't concealing himself. If we want to find him, he is willing, able, eager to be found. If we will ask, he will open doors that will allow us to see him. But see him, and this is important, for who he actually is.
Amen.
Not for who we've wanted him to be. Or who we've even been told, well-intended maybe even, who we've been told he was. God isn't hiding, and those who seek him will find him because God wants to be found. As he truly is. And because terms are often set when we go out searching for things, we miss obvious clues. We fumble over directions, and we pass by intersections where we probably should have taken a turn. Because if we already decided in our mind how it's supposed to go or where we're supposed to end up, then the search is limited in its effectiveness.
Right.
Sometimes we lose things. Right? I've lost a couple of things. I've lost my phone this week and my car keys. Right? The phone's gone. It's in the river. The car keys just came back to me this morning. Right?
Thanks, Jenna.
Thank you, Jenna. They were in the crevice of her couch. Right? James and Jenna had to do some digging. Find some popcorn, a couple of M&Ms in my car keys. But if I've already decided that the keys couldn't have been in a certain place, I would have never called James and asked him or texted him and asked him, hey, have you seen my car keys? If I had decided in my mind it wasn't possible for them to be there, my keys would still probably be in their couch. Rather than clipped to my bag safely with a D-ring this morning. Okay? And it's that way with God. If we've already decided, God, you can't be this way. This can't be your will. This couldn't possibly be your way. Then even when God is trying to illuminate the path and show us who he is and show us what his will is, we can't see it because we think it's impossible for that to be correct. But in the end, there are two roads. According to Jesus' words here, profound yet simple words. He says in verse 13, enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad the road, leading to where? To destruction. Why would the road to destruction be so populated? I remember reading this. I specifically remember reading this passage in 1991. When I was in the desert with that new Bible I had just been given. And I was confounded by this. It seemed right, but I couldn't figure out why it was right. Why are so many people on the road to destruction? Why do so many enter through that gate? In the Good News Bible, the one I was reading, it says the word easy is the way that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. In other words, one of the reasons it's so popular is because it's so simple. It's so common. It doesn't require anything of you. You get to make up all your own rules and all your own definitions and live how you see fit to live. But verse 14 says, small is the gate and narrow, or in the Good News version, hard is the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. I remember reading that and feeling unsettled by it, and I went to the chaplain. I saw him one day while we were at the mess tent getting breakfast, and I said, oh, he'll have an answer. So I took the Bible to him. I showed him the verse, and he took a look at it. He goes, well, and I'm not trying to disparage this guy. I think he meant to do well, but I think he was trying to be encouraging. He was just trying to calm me down. He goes, don't worry about it, right? If you believe that God exists, right? If you accept that Jesus Christ is your Savior, then you're fine. You are saved by that faith, and you don't need to worry about what this passage says. I think he was trying to help me, but I think he was wrong. I think this passage exists because Jesus was trying to unsettle people. He was trying to unsettle people who were comfortable with a certain notion and a certain definition of what it meant to seek after God. And it wasn't until I got unsettled that I began to really dig deeper and start to search. In seeking God or His will, it's so important to open ourselves up to the pursuit with honesty and without preconceived notions, and to be able to admit that some of the answers we might get might be hard. Let me ask you a question. Is something necessarily wrong because it is difficult? Is something by its very nature wrong because it's challenging? Marriage can be challenging.
Right.
Parenting sure is challenging sometimes. Work is challenging. Home ownership can be challenging. Automobile ownership can be challenging.
Roommates
You-
can be challenging.
Right? Your roommates, your friends and relationships, those can all be challenging. Getting an education, going to school is challenging, right? But we're still doing them because they're good things. They're worthy things. And so seeking after God, it might feel like that shouldn't be hard, that should be easy. But the Bible lays it out almost the opposite way. Like, look, the way that leads to God is the harder way.
Right.
And the easy way is the one that's actually leading away from God and toward destruction. I didn't like hearing that. I don't know if you like hearing that. You probably don't. But it doesn't make it not true. These are the words of the Lord Jesus Christ. Matthew chapter 7, verses 7 through 14. Okay, we're going to click one more passage here. And in Luke 15, we're going to read a parable. And in this parable, we're going to learn something about God. This was another passage that struck me while I was reading through the Bible in the desert. By the way, not trying to toot my horn here, just an example of how excited I was by this guy appearing and giving me this Bible in the middle of the desert.
Yeah.
He gave me that thing in somewhere around February of 1991, and by the middle of April, I had read the entire New Testament and half of the Old.
Dang.
I was
You were seeking.
reading that Bible, right? And the more I read, the more I got to know God for who He was, according to Scriptures, not according to some religious teaching that I had received, well-meaning or not. And I was intrigued. But this passage in particular taught me something about who God was. He wasn't that difficult, hard, unrelenting, demanding God that I had made him out to be in my head. He was actually quite different. Check this passage out. In verse 11 of Luke 15, Jesus said, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate. So he divided the property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, this share of the estate that he'd been given, and he set off for a distant country, and there he squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach even with the pods that the pigs were eating. But no one gave him anything. He was feeling low. When he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have had food to spare? And here I am starving to death. This guy in the parable was having what we would call an epiphany. He hit a low spot, and that low spot caused him, sometimes it's when we're flat on our back that we finally look up. Sometimes it's when we're stuck in the middle of the desert and people we know are perishing that we finally say, hey God, what is it that you want me to do? In verse 18, he resolves, I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I blew it. I've sinned against you and against heaven, and I am no longer worthy to be even called your son. So just make me like one of your hired servants. In his mind, God was going to be really, his father rather, was going to be really mad. And he wasn't even going to ask for sonship anymore. He just wanted something to eat. He just wanted to be treated even like a servant, like a hired man. That would be enough. His anticipation was that his father was going to be sticking it to him and making him earn it and really angry. And let's keep reading. Verse 20, he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. Not just general compassion, but compassion specifically for this son who had gone off and done awful things. And then after the semicolon, something scandalous happens. It says, he ran to his son, ran to him, threw his arms around him and kissed him. The son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer even worthy to be called your son. He's going through the speech. Verse 22, but the father said to his servants, he just kind of cuts in on it and says, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger. Put sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf, the one that we've been, overfeeding so that we could have a party with it someday, and kill it. And let's have a feast and let's celebrate, for the son of mine was dead and is alive again, was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. We see something here also that's simple yet profound. In the parable, God is portrayed, represented as who?
Father.
A father. And the person of the Father that we are shown that God is turns out to be a benevolent Father, a compassionate Father. It turns out that God is a seeker too. See, we're promised something. We're promised that if we seek, we will find. But God doesn't put all the seeking just upon us.
Right.
God is also continually working, continually looking out, and continually playing the role of seeker. He's powerful. He's pure. He's immeasurable. And yet, he is interested in us. He is wildly holy, beyond comprehension. And yet, simultaneously, still cares about you. Wherever you've been.
Right.
Whatever it is you've thought, been doing, been acting upon, God is interested in you.
Thank you.
And I know I'm speaking to a full array of hearts this morning. Some of us are on Facebook Live maybe watching, and you're only scrolling through because a friend sent you this link. And you wanted to be able to say, yeah, I checked it out. Hopefully you stuck around. And some of these words are resonating with you. Maybe you're not too sure about God. Some of you are established in a really healthy connection with God this morning. You sense His presence in your life. You have a thriving relationship with Him. And you're still trying to seek out His will as life unfolds. Others might know the good that they ought to be doing, but find ourselves continuing to turn back to old habits and old ways that we know are not good at all, but we just don't know how to get off of that wheel. Some of us may have drifted. Maybe we were once in a thriving relationship with God, and now we're really struggling. We're thinking about returning, but we're not too sure about that yet. Others are drifting in their seats, and they don't even realize it yet. There's a full array. And all of us have that same type of father, interested father, who's also a seeker, who, regardless of where we find ourselves, celebrates the fact that we are his children, is eager to give us his best. Regardless of where we find ourselves, I want you to know this morning that while God does call you to seek him, he too is a seeker, and he is very interested in you. During my life as a seeker, I've learned that God is more accessible, more tangible, more relational than I ever would have suspected when I began seeking. I've seen that it's not always easy. The road is difficult at times.
Right.
But I've never regretted the pursuit of God. I've never regretted trying to find God's will in my life. I've seen that the greatest impediment that I usually face in seeking after God hasn't been God, it's been me.
Yeah.
And the more I've revived myself and placed myself at the pinnacle of my existence, the harder it's been to keep an eye on God and his will and to figure out where he is. Conversely, the more that I've lost myself, the more I've made myself less significant than God in my own eyes, the easier it has been to see him, sense him, and find him. The truth is, I'm happier, I'm more fulfilled, I'm more purposeful, and I'm more at peace when I become less and God becomes more. Indeed, it might sound strange, but the best way to find God is to lose yourself.